Okay, great. So with that said, we're really excited for this discussion, Thorsten. Thank you for joining us. Just to recap, we're going to talk about how to integrate digital health into the pharma business model successfully and touch on a number of areas, including kind of organizational structure and talent, creating a business case and integrating that into the broader strategy, as well as outcomes and KPIs measurement. But before we jump into it, maybe an intro from you to the audience, as well as tell us a bit about something fun about you as well.
Super. Thank you, Gina. And thanks for having me today. So very excited to be here. And as you said, timely topic. So as mentioned, my name is Thorsten Rall. I'm leading digital transformation innovation at Novartis. And for people to get a little bit of a sense of what that means in the current context, Novartis has embraced I would say, full-on digital transformation in 2018, where we decided or took a decision to integrate data science, digital technologies, and also a different way of working into pretty much every part of our organization, ranging from research development to our commercial units and also in operations. And so we have been on the journey for quite a bit now, and how we take an organization from the very early steps, what are first lighthouse programs that you can drive, to now a case where it's much more around how do you actually embed those capabilities in the organization more deeply to really scale, which I think is likely the same challenge that almost every big pharma company has at this moment in the digital space. Now, for me personally, I've been on the journey since day one on. So I was part of the quote unquote founding team of the back then Chief Digital Organization or Chief Digital Office and the digital leadership team for Novartis, and have been really on this journey through all the different stages. And now in my role as head of digital transformation innovation, I'm responsible for, on the one hand, yes, functionally leading the digital space, but also I have a dedicated innovation unit that looks into more, I would say, high risk, high return, or disruptive innovation, if you want to call it that way, and has the capability to deliver those end to end, at least until proof of scale, along with a couple of other responsibilities, be it in partnerships, be it in governance in the digital space, and also more broadly, the innovation capability building for all of Novartis. So I hope my learnings, because there are quite a few that we've made over the last couple of years, will be helpful for people on the line. I'm very much looking forward to the discussion.
Awesome. Thank you. And that's really helpful context. Maybe just to kick us off, in the last 3 to inching 4 years, since you've been with through this digital journey at Novartis since the inception, how much progress do you think we've made, if you were to give it a number?
On which scale?
Maybe we'll do 1 to 10, 10 being.
Okay. So I would say we are likely at a 7.
Okay.
And in hindsight, of course, you would always say you would have thought or expected things to go faster. I think the reality of the matter is that we've made quite good progress on a couple of large programs. We've been driven in implementing those and bringing those to a large number of associates. We have like thousands of associates in our field force, leveraging analytics insights, leveraging real-time suggestions on next best actions. So we have thousands of users on an integrated analytics platform in the development space. So really good progress on those specific areas. The one area, the reason why I didn't put us at a 8, 9, or 10 is that I believe we are still not at a point where data and digital is just becoming second nature to everybody in the organization. Which at the end of the day, when you think about what the future will bring for a pharma company, and given the magnitude and pace of change around us, this ability of working differently and innovating faster in a more focused way without having to, let's say, spend a lot of focus on how to do it actually, is a capability that pharma needs to develop. And we are not fully there yet.
Yeah, and that's perfect segue into what I wanted to ask you about. So how do we build this capability, right? And tell us, and I'll just give you a brain dump of what I'm thinking. So are you looking for these nuggets of the right skill sets and talents internally and saying, okay, let's get all these people together, form the central function and get them to help evangelize this sort of a mindset across? Or are you sending feelers externally to say, let's hire the right type of talent, because there are some very specific role types that you might need in the new data digital driven pharma company, or is it a mixture of two? Maybe tell us a bit about how you've so far built this capability and the innovation function within your organization.
Yeah, very happy to. And I think before I go into the concrete talent question that you asked, I think there are, of course, a couple of different factors that are really important for any team doing innovation or individual doing innovation to be successful in a pharma context, right? So one of it, of course, do you have the right talent? One is like, what is the organizational setup? What is the governance around the team? How do you build the right mindset and leadership? And I guess it would be worth digging a little bit into each one of those. But if I can speak to the talent point immediately. So the answer there is, when I look back at Novartis, we essentially pursued a hybrid approach, right? So we had a couple of really talented people in the space from the get-go. So Pharma being a very data-driven organization, you usually have more data scientists, for example, distributed across your organization than you might be aware of. So one of the first things we did was actually take stock and even try to find all those people, because they usually don't have the same name. They're not captured or tagged in your internal system, just to get a sense of how many data scientists do we have? How many data architects do we have? How many people do we have that have experience in building digital product? So that was the first step. But then, of course, you very quickly also find gaps that you need to address, right? Mm-hmm. So when it comes to, let's say, really edgy data science at a more, the real edge of the science piece of it, not so much applied data science, but really trying to come up with the next algorithm that can be used, for example, in research. These are areas where we had gaps. And there we usually went in with an approach where we established partnerships very early on. That had those capabilities. And then over time, as we learned, if this was a capability that in the mid to long term, we really wanted to have internally as Novartis, we transitioned that over, right? Always, and I think that transitioning is something you need to pay special attention to, simply because you have to make sure that you have a couple of key people hired early on that actually can take over the task that your partner does. And you have to do that early, because otherwise you're essentially having a partner trying to transition and hand over to nobody there to take the rein on. And you also need the people give them enough time to actually learn on the programs that the external partners are working on. That's number one. Number two is that you have to be very transparent with your partner on what the plan is, right? Because you will continue to work with them, but it also has to be clear that you're planning to transition certain capabilities over time internally, and that you also expect them to help you in making this successful and make it often. I mean, we usually made it a part of the quote unquote KPIs that we had for big partnerships. How successful we there in building the internal capabilities that we wanted to complement initially with that partnership. Then when you think, I think you also had a question more around the actual organizational setup on how you bring those talent together in a meaningful way. And I think there, we actually went through a couple of phases. So early on, we just, I guess as most companies do, we try to pursue a more COE kind of approach, right? So you had a small central team that served as the nucleus to create momentum around certain initiatives, where you had a concentration of these capabilities. But over time, we actually moved it more, or built a structure that more resembling the overall structure of Novartis as well. So that means that we went to a more hub and spoke model, where you brought more and more of those capabilities into the business units and into the functions to really drive programs jointly with them. And when in the stage where we are now, I think we are now at a point where you differentiate essentially between what kind of innovation are you trying to drive. Right? Because innovation in the digital space is not equal innovation. I think most people on the line have heard about the 70-20-10 rule or any other kind of cut that you want to use, where you think about 70% being incremental, relatively short-term innovation, and incremental in this case is nothing bad, because most of the time that's where the most short-term value comes from. 20% being more proven innovation from other fields being transferred into new fields, and then 10% is going like all the way out there.
Yeah.
And when it comes to the organization, you will be looking into different organizational setups for these different kinds of innovation that you want to drive.
Yeah. And do you think this is working, starting with a small central team and then decentralizing, going hub and spoke? Or have you attempted a couple of other models and that maybe has not worked and you've had to improvise? Can you say a bit more about your learnings along the way?
So, is it working? I think overall it worked well. I think the tricky piece is you need to get the timing right on when you transition from one to the other.
Yeah.
And we also maybe even before that, we had a situation that I think is most common or has been most common in pharma, where we had digital practitioners pretty much spread out individually in different functions and BUs. And that was a model where, as a starting formation, it did serve us not very well, simply because you don't create that, I would say, takeoff velocity that you need to really kick off the transformation. And in the end of the day, that's also because I would argue a couple of years ago, people were not quite clear on how profound the change is that you need to instill in your organization if you want to go on the digital journey.
Mm-hmm.
And that lift is only possible if you somewhere create a critical mass to really be the initial force and initial driver behind it. And I assume that a lot of people had the same experience, to be honest. Now, along the way, what we need to, or what we learned was that you need to very early on then define a capability map in sense where you say, okay, what are the key critical capabilities you want to build in the organization and where do you actually want to build them? Because more often than not, once you have this initial momentum, you have a lot of efforts being sprung up, right? And part of them are driven by the central team, part of them not. And then you have, wherever those efforts are sprung up, people start to build capabilities to deliver against those, around those efforts. And that leaves you with again, fragmented landscape where you have a lot of expertise, also quite a lot of duplication often, and an operating model that becomes increasingly complex as you grow. It's almost like the experience, I guess, that many startups make when they move from like being a small startup to being a big startup, when you need to include more structure and more quote unquote process into how you operate to be really successful. And that is the learning that in hindsight, and you're always smarter afterwards, but in hindsight, I would have included some of those mechanisms earlier and into our journey, and maybe feel the quote unquote growing pains a little bit less than what we have felt, because oftentimes sorting things out afterwards is much harder than just designing them right from the get-go. Yeah,
I think that's a really good reflection. And just on that note of mindset, to double click on it, so how are you encouraging this fail fast model, or are you encouraging the fail fast, keep testing and quickly iterate, which is kind of that is the startup model, right? And do you believe that that's the mindset you want to inculcate, and is that working? If yes.
So number one, yes, it is clearly a critical mindset. I usually say it's a learn fast mindset. I don't like I mean, I know that usually you say fail fast, but for me, it's much more everything you do. It's going to be good in the end, and if it's not good, it's not the end. So in that sense, you just learn. You don't really fail along the way. But to keep it short, yes, of course, that's critically important. And have we fully achieved it across the whole organization at the moment? I would say no. But a couple of things that we have put in place. So one of the first efforts that we launched was actually establishing, and that might sound a little bit counterintuitive now, but was establishing a more harmonized innovation approach that we are pursuing in the digital space across all of Novartis. And that innovation approach is really designed to ask specific questions, starting, of course, always from the famous are you really understanding the problem you're trying to solve?
Yeah.
Which is always a funny question to ask, but then more often than not, you don't get a very satisfactory answer. Are you really understanding the key problem you're trying to solve? To what is actually a non-functional way of testing if the problem or a solution to your problem might work? What is the cheapest way to test the hypothesis on value creation, feasibility, viability of your program, which is designed to really give you those learning points in very rapid iterations, but also then pretty much give you the go, no-go points in rapid iterations. And it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to stop everything, but you just go back to the previous phase, right? And having that approach is very important, because what I found is a lot of people kind of conceptually get the idea of learn fast, fail fast, but then in actually implementing it, it's not easy, right? Because you don't know what do you actually need to know to take a decision on whether you failed or whether you need to stop, and when. And how do you get out of the pitfall of having too much pre-investment so that you're overly committed to the success of a program, even though it might not be a good idea after all? So that was the first step. And along with that approach, of course, we launched the, I would say, traditional change management support, ranging from capability building programs for practitioners, coaches, but also for leadership, which I think is very important, because the role of the leadership is also different in that setup. Where it's much more around asking questions and probing questions, as opposed to trying to know the answer for your team, which is a mindset change in itself. So that was one component. The second component, equally important, is that to make this fast learning work, you also need to tackle the reasons why fast iterations are hard, often within pharma companies. Right, so that is, it's very hard to onboard new partners. It's very usually it's pretty hard to generate any evidence or insights with patients. And I'm not talking about clinical trials now, but really in the digital space, just getting access to them, getting feedback. It's pretty hard to go to our information security and information safety assessments, right? So all these kind of things that actually make it harder for teams to follow that rapid pace. And once you're not able to follow through that rapid pace, automatically, you're also less willing to take decisions or learn or fail, right? Because you're just increasing your personal investment in it. So we've established a couple of teams. The Biome is one, but also other teams like the Enabling Guild in Novartis that are really focused on trying to take those hurdles not completely out of the way, but at least make those hurdles a little bit less high so that people can move faster through the process. And by that, you, on the one hand, create an understanding of how you move more iterative, more value focused, but also give them the tools to really do it in practice.
I think that's really great. And I was going to ask you for an example, and you gave that right there, Biome, in terms of how you try to lower the barriers, so to speak. How many such cheap and easy tests would you say are ongoing at any given point in time?
You mean how many programs we have at any given point in time in that approach?
Yeah.
I mean, across Novartis, a couple of hundred.
Okay. Wow. That's and this is all digital health focused.
That is all digital health focused. I mean, it's of course cutting across development and commercial, medical, and so on. But yeah, it's all digital health focused.
Wow. And how many of, so if you look back at the past couple of hundred, how many of those actually then make it forward? Because you've dropped a whole bunch, right?
So usually, we haven't fully went through the whole portfolio, to be honest. But you generally see a drop of rate that is north of like 60 to 70% of programs that really run through the funnel only. And I guess that number will go further down once one or the other solution has really achieved full scale, because then you will need to also make a decision on if you happen to have 2 or 3 solutions that work but address the same pain point. Do you want to keep those, or do you want to go to one in full? But yeah, usually you have like a 60 to 70% dropout. at least.
Okay, wow, that's quite significant. So it actually validates and warrants the need to keep experimenting a lot.
I mean, I would, to be honest, I would like to have it higher. And
The
I mean,
drop off,
I would like to have it higher and early, because for me, if it's not high enough, you're likely not taking enough risks in the programs you're running, or you're just not taking the tough decisions, which is the other. I mean, both is not good. But I'm usually striving to have really a lot of programs in the idea stage, because that's where essentially for many of the efforts we are running, you kind of know where you want to go, but you don't know how to get there. So you need that broad funnel at the beginning. And then if you have a huge drop off from idea to validation, that's no problem at all, because you haven't really spent any money on it, right? So I would rather have it even higher, because what I found oftentimes, even when we enter a program into the quote unquote funnel or into that approach, a lot of the times quite a bit of pre-work has already been done, right? So I guess there is an invisible part of the funnel that I don't even see,
where the investment in time and energies have gone. And I'm just curious to understand, with all of these ideas, do they have to make a business case upfront to even get into the cycle of experimentation to really see, okay, is this a fit? So one is to ID the problem or the gap that is filling, which is fine, but ultimately it could be fulfilling a need, but does it really fit into the overarching strategy? So you've got to make a really strong business case for it. Is that what you look for? Is that what you seek from any partner that comes on board, or any internal that comes up?
So for the individual program, the answer, I mean, the short answer is yes. I mean, business case in the sense of that it has to align with the strategic priorities of our business. And I think I didn't talk about that before, but to me, when you ask about what does it take for innovation teams to be successful, I think embedding them in an environment where they actually have access to the decision makers and to the people that own the strategy and own the budget going forward is critically important, right? So because a pharma, I mean, in my view, a pharma company should not take the role of a VC, right? We are not a VC company. We're not just going out there trying to find the next unicorn. I think there are many other people in the VC space that are much better at that than we are. So there has to be a connection to our strategic priorities. Now, how detailed that business case has to be, it doesn't have to be super detailed at the beginning, right? And it also, I mean, to be honest, it doesn't have to be, because you're also not spending a lot of money on it, right? So it's not a decision where you're making, okay, if I don't have a business case that gives me X million, you can put in whatever number you want, with a probability of X, I'm not going to invest in it. You don't have to do that if you follow that stage gauge approach, right? Because the money you spend at the beginning, it's mostly good enough in this case if you say, you have a sizable number of people that have a certain problem, and you think you can solve that problem, and here's why you think that this problem can actually translate into value, and value can be different, defined, right? If you're talking to people in medical or commercial or in the development space, right? So that's at some point, of course, over the course of these iterations, you have to be able to turn, number one, the business case into, usually I would really want to see a financial value somehow allocated to it, but also show increasing proof that you are marching towards delivering the value. And that is not only true in the early ideation phase, but also when you launch, right? So be very clear on what are the indicators you are showcasing and you're putting up front to show and prove that you're on the track to value generation, which I think is often also another problem that teams face, specifically in the digital space, is that they are confronted with this, show me, I mean, let's just take an example. Show me the script lift that you're generating with your solution, right? But that lift will only come pretty far out in the future. So the question is, what are the indicators you want to show that can actually give confidence that you are on the path to showing the actual business numbers that you trying to achieve And I mean, you can think of classical things like, of course, first you look into how many patients are even going on your solutions. Then you go into how many patients are actually doing a certain action triggered on a trigger that you have in the solution, and so on and so forth. And really make your case better and better over the course of that journey. And really think about it in the same way that you would think about with a VC company in that sense, where you also have to somehow prove that you're on the right track without necessarily being able to show the financials yet.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to dig a little bit deeper into that, but I just wanted to give a heads up to everybody listening that you can feel free to send your questions through the chat or through the Q&A, and I'll pick them up as they come along, because I'm sure as Thorsten says stuff, it might spark some ideas. So Thorsten, I think this KPI conversation is really important, and maybe, let's take an example of a partner that you found externally, but they address a specific gap or need that you've identified. Help us maybe dissect a little bit into the mechanics of what that deal looks like. And you spoke about being super transparent upfront on expectations on both sides, and then defining what the KPIs will look like, both financial and non-financial. Can you maybe walk us through what one such example looks like?
So yeah, so let me take an example where we actually partnered with a big tech company, and I don't have to say the name. If people Google it, they will likely know there are not too many options who I can talk about now. And here the situation was that that was linked to the capability question you had at the beginning, right? So here the situation was that we said one of our key strategic pillars in our digital strategy early on was to drive data science insights in the research and development area. Now, when we took that decision, we didn't necessarily have all the capabilities needed to do that. So in that partnership, there were a couple of angles that we said we want to get out of the partnership. First one was, for the time being, we would like to have access to your leading experts in certain data science fields that need to be dedicated to products that we are working on jointly with our internal teams. Secondly, we would like to get access to the roadmaps that you have on different products, to get a sense of what are applications that we might not be aware of today, but will be driving forward. And thirdly, by doing so, we expect to generate a significant financial benefit for the organization in a 3 to 5 year horizon. Right? There were a couple of others, but let's just stick with that. And we structured that partnership around exactly those dimensions, right? So we essentially set up, for the first one, we set up a survey where we really monitored what kind of data experts are really working with our teams. When we get the feedback from the teams, is the work they are doing with them, do they quote unquote learn something along the way? Do they spend enough time on the programs? Regular reviews on what are the new technologies or solutions that the partner has brought in proactively that are relevant to our strategy. And we had a couple of pivots actually in that journey. And then the third is just quote unquote monitoring in this case, we had a whole portfolio of different programs we're actually running together, monitoring the progress and the value creation of the programs we have in the pipeline, and also rejuvenation rates of the pipeline. Now, for smaller partnerships, you don't necessarily have always like all these dimensions baked into the partnership. But what's generally true is you need to have the business case for the overall program, right? I mean, that's what I mentioned before. But then within that, you need to have a strategy on why you are partnering with somebody, right? So what are really the specific value levers that you want to get from the partner? And also, what is the value that the partner wants to get from you, right? Which is something that we sometimes tend to forget. And then be very clear about, okay, if that's the value lever, how would we actually measure that? A different example is in one partnership, we said one of the key things we would like to get is actually getting your innovation methodologies baked into our organization. Right. So what we did there was really going after we had finished programs and pretty much did assessments with our own teams, trying to understand, well, beyond the content of the program, have you actually learned something about how you go about innovation in the first place? And the mechanics and approaches that you can leverage there to understand, is the capability angle of the partnership actually working, or do we need to do something there? And in the first iteration, we found that the programs ran well, but the capability transfer was actually not happening. So we had to pivot and essentially say, okay, now let's really take a conscious decision and say, what is the methodology concretely that we're going to bring in that approach? Do we have all the right people from the part are not only good in the methodology, but also in teaching the methodology to help that capability transfer? And it is, I mean, in these bigger partnerships, we have just very regular alliance or partnership reviews. So we literally go, this is what we originally said we would like to see. This is where we think we are against what we would have liked to see. And these are the areas where we need to work on and pivot.
Yeah. And out of curiosity, have you seen any obvious differences in how R&D versus commercial versus maybe manufacturing, supply chain, other areas respond to and operate within this innovation space? Do you think some of them are ahead in terms of, you know, taking ideas and growing them, or bringing more, having success?
In terms of general differences, that's a bit hard to say. I think, of course, you always have to understand that these organizations are operating in very different contexts, right? So when you're operating in the research space, these teams tend to have much more freedom on what they are allowed to do and what they can experiment with, right? So usually in research, it's quote unquote much easier to bring a new technology in, to bring a new approach in, to bring new algorithms in, to just see if something comes out, because you're not really operating in a regulated environment. That, of course, changes quite dramatically as soon as you enter development, where everything you do is put on a lot of scrutiny, and you have to kind of like iterate, test before you can put anything even close to applying it, let's say, live in a clinical trial. So I guess it's less a question of how open they are. It's just a reflection of what level and what environment they operate in. And then in the commercial space, I guess you're somewhere in between, right? So it's not quite as free flowing. And of course, there it's also quite dependent on which market you're looking to. Some of the more traditional European markets, very different from China, very different from the US. So I think you just have to always have empathy with the colleagues and with the teams, and for the market they are actually active and trying to drive business. Yeah,
that's really fair. Some really interesting questions coming in, so I'm going to jump right in. One is, in your opinion, how long does a digital innovation experiment, how long should it last? And what should be the budget allocated for these experiments? And then just as a follow-on to that question, how do you manage system validation or compliance requirements in this short duration of time during these experiments?
Yeah. Okay, so that's I try to not give the "it depends" answer. So let me give you maybe a concrete example. So in the commercial space, when we look at the very initial phase, which is essentially ideation to having a concept of what a solution could look like, not a working prototype. I mean, just like a concept, right? We're usually going for something 8 to 12 weeks max. And then for another 6 months max until you have the solution to be proven to be scalable in the operating system. Now, of course, this can always take longer depending on what partner you're working with. I mean, there's a lot of variability around that. In terms of the budget that you should be allocating for the initial phase,
Thorsten, I think your volume's gone off on your mic.
Am I still there, or can you not hear me
Yes,
anymore?
perfect.
You're back, thanks.
Okay,
So
perfect.
we
So
lost you after the, so we spoke about the timelines and now you were starting the budget.
Yeah, so on the budget for this very initial phase from ideation to concept, we literally just have like a concept on a page, right? With maybe a couple of user interviews and validation of your hypothesis. I mean, you're talking beyond the time and of the people, and of course the cost of the people working on it, usually just a couple of 10K, to be honest, right?
Okay.
Because you don't really build anything at this stage. And then afterwards, to be honest, there the variability can be huge. I mean, it's very different if you're going into building a completely new data science solution that is cutting edge versus if you're quote unquote deploying an off-the-shelf solution and just tweak it a little bit. So there it's hard to give concrete numbers for that space. But it would never, I mean, it shouldn't go into like the millions of dollars, just to be clear, right? Yeah.
And
Does that answer the question?
Yeah, absolutely. The second part of the question, I think you kind of touched on with the mentions of the bio, but I think it's a little bit deeper than that. It's how do you manage system validation or compliance requirements in these short spurts of experimentation?
Yeah. So on the compliance requirements, essentially what we do is when we are very early in the process, we give our compliance teams and our teams in TT that do the data security validation, teams in procurement, pretty much a heads up of what we are working on without necessarily involving them very closely, right? Because there we say, we are so early, we don't really have anything to share, but we want you to be aware that there might be something coming. When it comes to the validation of the actual solution, also we are following an approach where we say if we are still in pilot phase, so just having a first test either in a sandbox or even in one small unit, we have a slimmed down compliance process, so to say, that is just based on the risk that we are really incurring. And then once you go into full scale, in the pilot phase, when we see, okay, it might actually have it there, then we go through the full application period. So we're somehow parallelizing the compliance to a certain degree along the way. And we're also just tinkering it or tailoring it to what is the actual risk exposure that you have at a given point in time. And when you need to have a full deep dive. I mean, one of the questions we often get is when you come to third-party risk management, right? Or third-party risk assessment. If you do a full risk assessment, that takes a couple of months, and it actually still takes a couple of months. But you don't need that full risk assessment if you don't even know if you're going into an operational partnership with that party, right? So when we are still in piloting, we have like a slimmed down TPRM process to really capture that specific environment, and then only go into the full assessment if we have more clarity, if there's really a longer term and operational partnership.
And that's great that, you know, the compliance teams have also iterated their processes in order to enable some of this in a more streamlined way. So that's really good to hear. I think there's a further kind of digging into this. Any more details on the funnel from ideation through to MVP? How many do you start with, and rejection ratio? I think you did mention this, it was 60-70%, unless you have something more to add.
So I would have to look up the numbers really for stage by stage. I know that for the overall drop off from ideation to the pilot, or let's say proof of pilot or scalability, is around the 60-70%. The individual stages, I would actually have to look up the numbers.
Yeah, of course. The next question is really interesting as well. How do you deploy a digital solution that involves patients or prescribers globally, but you have to meet local regulation, medical approvals, and other compliance needs, right? So is it better to have a framework with the local team and build up an application locally, and then take it globally, or vice versa? And yeah, so just any thoughts on the transferability, I guess?
Yeah. So that's a journey we are on at the moment, to be honest, right? So there are a couple of solutions where the solution is part of your drug product, right? So a regulated, connected solution, and in that case, you don't really have much choice of saying, do you want to build it local only every single time, because it's actually going through your development process with your product. So you have to go from global to local. And the way we think about this at the moment, and it's really a thinking stage, is that we will have a localization, a local deployment team that actually moves around with the product, and helps the teams really understand what are any tweaks that we need to play back to the central product team to meet local regulations, and also do that as part of the development process already, right? So that we are sure that at least for the main markets, we do have the regulatory requirements met when we go to market. But this is really I would say a learning journey that we are on at the moment. Now, the situation is a bit different when you are going into, let's say, non-regulated digital solutions, and there we actually have a bit of a mix at the moment. But there we see more and more teams going with local solutions that are already available, because they also tend to have a local customer base already. And only in exceptional cases, we take a partner and like bring one partner to many countries where we see we have a strategic alignment between the regional footprint the partner wants to go versus the regional footprint that we are actually interested in. Because then the partner is also the one that is going more into the regulatory space and the market building for us, as opposed to us having to do that for the partner.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really, actually, that was going to be my next question, but you pretty much answered it there. So it's about tactically choosing the right partner, because then it's in both of your interests to navigate that space. Okay, that's great. And I think just through the conversation, I've been thinking, Thorsten, we've been referring to digital health in a pretty broad sense, right? And so with that in mind, has it ever come up, or is this in the roadmap for, at the moment, we're talking about everything that just enhances the current portfolio products, right? And it's patient support programs or SAMDs, et cetera. Is there any vision, and if there is, how does that really fit into the broader kind of pharma strategy to be kind of virtual first or digital first, really come out with a digital only asset? Is that even on the roadmap?
I mean, I think every pharma company is somehow looking into that space. I mean, from where I sit at the moment, I would say the verdict on whether pharma is going to do this, yes or no, is still a little bit out, because there are, as you're aware, right? I mean, there are still a lot of questions to be answered on what's the commercial model, how do you bake it into the overall operating model of a big pharma company. So I think the current answer is there's definitely interest, but there's no decision yet.
Yeah. Just looking at the questions again, there's another question. How important is encouraging internal stakeholders to be innovative? And how have you found harnessing existing expertise in Novartis to embrace digital innovation?
What's the second one?
The second one is, how have you found harnessing existing expertise? So what's been kind of the response to embrace digital innovation?
So on the first point, for me the answer, and now that's my personal view. To me, the answer is a clear yes, because innovation should not be innovation. Given the different facets of innovation that exist, should not be something that only a small subgroup of people do, right? Because to me, the process of innovating and thinking about how you can do what you do differently and maybe better actually helps every single associate, not only, I mean, in their individual work immediately, but it also gives you, let's say, the mental continuous flexibility and kind of trains the muscle of innovation. So at the end of the day, I think everybody should be innovating. The important piece is that if you're innovating, you should do it following a certain approach and methodology, right? Because what should not happen is that you just like have innovation like springing up, be it value adding or not, in a completely uncontrolled way. But you have to enable as many people as possible to innovate in your organization. You should not try to monopolize innovation, right? At least not if you just talk about innovation more generally. There are always going to be certain elements. I mean, I'm not going to start doing research, obviously, but in the broader sense, no, you shouldn't limit that. The way how you tap into innovation or innovative people in the organization. So at Novartis, what we have been doing is we've created what we call the community of communities, which in the end of the day is we did literally like a screening of what are the different interest groups that we can find, and I'm sure that we are not complete yet, but that we can find where people came together to somehow drive innovation, exchange ideas, like bounce ideas or find talent on problems they have. And we brought all of those together in what we call a community of communities. It's not a formal structure, but it's more a way for the different people to exchange learnings, to also share best practices and see if you have something that really worked well in one part of the organization, can it work in another part? And what I found quite interesting is that these communities are extremely powerful when it comes to disseminating what I called before these like incremental innovation pieces, right? That are not too complicated to implement, don't need a lot of change effort and change management coming with it. So really sharing those in these communities is super powerful, because they can just then take it, and before you know it, something moves from Kuala Lumpur to Mexico within minutes, really, and really makes its way across the globe. Right? I mean, very helpful tool. And it's also, I mean, very selfishly, of course, a kind of recruiting ground, because if you have that community, as soon as you have specific positions opening in that space, you at least know where to go to find the people interested in it.
Very interesting. And is that like a grassroots? Is there a self-nominated sort of lead for each group?
So at the moment, yeah. So you just the way it was not really planned that way, because you had this like grassroots communities popping up and emerging across the organization. It was then more bringing them together. But the way the communities emerged, they all came up with a natural or implicit 1 or 2 or 3 people that somehow were managing the community and took the leadership position, and those are the ones that we brought together first.
Okay, and I'm really curious about if there was an innovation that, you know, internal groups came up with, so sans an external partner possibly. I've always been intrigued by the idea of a pharma spinout, and there's very few, right, to even name. I think a handful of them only. What are your thoughts on that?
So I think I said before that pharma should not be VC. I would, for me, the purpose of an innovation program in pharma the main purpose of an innovation program in pharma should not be to spin it out, right? So that being said, I think there are a couple of scenarios where a spin out makes sense, but the starting point should be a problem or something that you're trying to solve that is in line with the strategy of the pharma company. Now, there are a couple of scenarios, one being you have developed something internally that actually works and creates value for pharma, but at the same time, it might not be a competitive differentiator really, or in your core business. And number 3, for it to thrive and continue to create value, you need to put investment behind it that is not justified, given the fact that it's not a competitive advantage or a competitive advantage at the core of your business, right? And then the question is, what do you do in that instance? Yeah. And if all these conditions apply, spinning the solution or product or whatever you have been developing might actually be a feasible model, right? Yeah. Just to keep it alive, to make sure that you continue to benefit from it, but you also give it the means to grow and the access to capital it needs to grow. So that's one scenario. And I think then there are, I think in the past, there's also a scenario where you launch something, but then over the course of the development and the uptake, you learn that actually the fact that a pharma company is the or one of the majority holders and decision makers in that solution is holding the solution back from delivering the value it has, right? So sounds maybe a little bit theoretical, but very practical. If you're developing a solution that is helping diagnosing patients for a specific disease, being a pharma company that is trying to promote a solution that helps diagnose patients for a specific disease might be a tricky thing for the healthcare system, because there's always this underlying assumption that you're actually just trying to do it for something that you have in your own drug portfolio, right? So the success and the adoption of that solution is impeded by the fact that it's owned by pharma. Now, if you still believe that it's very valuable, and it's in this case also has nothing to do with the drug per se, then taking this and taking it with a partner and spin it out might also be the best solution, because it creates that distance and that objectivity and independence that the market would seek to really adopt it and pick it up in full.
I love that. I love that we've come up with a bit of a thesis right now of how and when to spin things out as a pharmaceutical company. I'm just going to look at, in the last few minutes, a couple more questions. How have you managed patient data consent when you believe there will be future opportunities to connect the data?
So on the consent side, in our clinical trials, we have adjusted the consent form in line with GDPR to make sure that we have the ability to use the data going forward. Now, going backwards, there's nothing much we can really do about it, right? So the consent form is what it is, and that also in some areas limits what we can use the data for, because going back to individual patients now, years after a trial has been completed, is a very tedious and partially impossible effort. So essentially what we do now is, like, for everything we're launching now, going forward, we are putting consent forms in that allow us to use the anonymized data for scientific purposes. But we, of course, always very stringent and sticking to the regulatory environment, right? So we're not going beyond GDPR, what GDPR allows, and also not what GDPR allows in certain, or how GDPR is, for example, interpreted in different markets.
Yeah. And then the next question is, what are your thoughts on how the culture of adopting a product mindset has evolved in Novartis over time? So historically, digital innovation was led by brand teams and had a campaign mindset. Do you feel that Novartis has a product mindset now? And what makes you most excited about what's changing in the organization to adopt better practices?
So that's a very interesting journey we're on. Right, and the product mindset is definitely something that we've been working on a lot. So of course you still have the brand product mindset, right? Because I think that's also not going to go away. But what we've been investing in over the last years is really building in parallel a capability for, I would say, what you could call maybe technology product mindset. And the way we are organizing those is really with mixed teams between, let's say, the pharma organization or wherever the product sits, plus our TT organization, our data science teams, with one clear product owner that's responsible for driving the product roadmap and the feature roadmap, and also that is in the end responsible for scaling of the product. Now, have we fully sorted it out? I would say no, because there are still a lot of, I would say, our standard processes that are not tilted and tailored towards being effective for a product environment. I mean, one of the processes we did change, though, is the financing. So we established now an option to actually have product financing, as opposed to the classical waterfall financing mechanisms in our organization. But of course, there are many other processes, let's say in talent, let's say in incentive alignment across units that we still need to work through. I personally, I always have been, I continue to be super excited about the product journey, because I think it's really the mechanism for a pharma company to scale the solutions and keep the focus on the value of the solutions that is needed to drive the transformation with the right speed and agility going forward.
And final question for you, Thorsten, what do you look forward to in 2022? What can we expect from you and from Novartis this year?
Oh, so in 2022, so there are quite a few big programs going on in the pharma or now innovative medicine space that I cannot really say too much about, but they are very going into quite radical innovation angle that I'm personally super excited about. Equally in the development unit, a lot of fundamental things being looked at and how we can do things really fundamentally differently. And that's what I'm personally always very excited, right? Getting the chance of almost take a blank sheet of paper and think how you would do it if you could just start it from scratch. And that's what we'll be working on in various places over the course of 22.
To be unveiled maybe on the next discussion that we have. Hopefully you'll be able to share. This was an incredible conversation, Thorsten, and I've learned so much in the last 60 minutes, and thank you for being candid as well in sharing your experiences and thoughts with us. What we'll be doing is sharing this link and the webinar with some key takeaways with everybody that joined, as well as with the wider HealthXL community. So thank you so much for joining us and for your afternoon. And we wish you all the best with everything you have, with the exciting journey you have lined up for the rest of the year.
Thank you very much for having me. It was a pleasure.